Okay, so what I want to do tonight is kind of do an introduction to First Thessalonians. How did that church begin? You remember what missionary journey was Paul on when he founded Thessalonica congregation? Well, look over in Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17, that's when he's there at Thessalonica. And turn your page over to chapter 15, and you might have a heading inside chapter 15. Which missionary journey was he on? Mine says second missionary journey for me. There right at verse 36, this is when Paul and Barnabas say they want to return, go check on the brethren, see how they are doing in each city. And that's when they had that disagreement about whether or not they wanted to take John Mark. And so Paul is on the way, and who does he take with him, since Barnabas goes his own way, and Paul takes who? Silas. And then they get up there and make their way to Thessalonica. Now, before he gets there, he was at Philippi. He gets run out of there. He goes over there to Thessalonica. And Paul usually began his work in a city where? At a synagogue, where he would find a ready audience. They've already got some religious background, roots. Luke tells us that for 3 Sabbath days he reasons with his fellow Jews from the Scripture. In verse 2 of Acts chapter 17, it really substantiates that Paul was presenting evidence to convince the Jews of what he was teaching. And Luke reference to Scriptures would have a reference to the Old Testament. So Paul is helping the Jews, giving them evidence from the Old Testament, the prophets and the law, to show and give them an understanding of what the Old Testament was teaching about the coming Christ. And 2 words in verse 3 also help us see this. When it says that Paul was doing his preaching, he was explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I am proclaiming to you is the Christ. I like the word there for explaining. It's 2 Greek words being combined. One means open, another one means through. And so he's opening the Scripture to the people there in Thessalonica, bringing it open to their eyes, bringing it out of the old, or the prophets and the law, to them so they can see it. He says he's giving evidence. You see that one in there as well. Literally place or set beside, and it means to bring it forward. So he's proving things to them. So Paul's bringing this message from the Scripture to prove his point about who the Messiah is. And only then could he declare really effectively that Jesus was really the Messiah. But put yourself there in Thessalonica. Say you've been a pretty good Jew. You've been attending synagogue all your life and listening to the teachers. You don't know much about what has been going on down in Jerusalem. You may have heard some news here and there, but not much. But you do hear about this fellow Paul, this rabbi has come to town, and he is going to preach. And so you're a bit excited about that. You have some strong convictions about the Messiah being taught from your youth by the rabbis, but your concept of the Messiah is wrong. What was the typical concept of who the Messiah would be for the Jews? Okay, another David? A worldly king that's going to lead an army and get rid of the Romans once and for all. So here you, on this Sabbath day, you come to the synagogue and you discover this visiting rabbi, and he's going to talk on about the Messiah, but he says that the Messiah was destined to suffer, die, and be raised again. You had never heard anything like this before. If you had been taught your whole life that the Messiah was going to be this earthly king, was going to lead an army and bring Israel back to its former glory, and then you heard this rabbi say this, what would you be looking for next? If I came and told you the Messiah is going to come, he's going to be handed over to the Gentiles, he'll be killed and be raised on the 3rd day, what would be your response to that? Yeah, where's your evidence? That's why Luke uses those terms for evidence twice in those first few verses.
Because the rabbis just skipped Isaiah 53?
Well, they did. look at today. Do people misinterpret obvious passages today? Well, they do. And they did it back then too. So Paul will go to maybe, I don't know, but maybe he went to Isaiah 53 to prove the suffering Messiah would endure, like you were saying. Then he'd maybe turn to Psalm 16, as Peter did on the day of Pentecost. Remember that in Acts chapter 2? He went over there proving that David was speaking of the Messiah being resurrected back to life and not of himself. Yet all of that would have been a real revelation to any Jew, and not an easy one for them to swallow because they had never thought of it this way. The evidence was clearly there in the Scripture, but you would have read or heard of these texts, but you never saw the true meaning before. Yeah, I'm sure they probably did talk about those things, but when you're given a particular thought in the beginning, you get stuck with that. And then that lie gets stuck in your mind, and then you can't see anything else unless you can somehow remove it and try to read things as if you're reading it for the first time. And so Paul is presenting evidence to them. And so then, as you're thinking maybe all this and you're running it through your mind, the rabbi, Paul up there, says that the Messiah has already come. Now, would that be a shocker for those guys there at the synagogue? You missed him. He already was here, and now he's gone back to heaven. Oh, yeah, and your siblings killed him. So there was a man in Judea, suffered just as the prophets predicted, was raised from the dead, and he would explain that the resurrection was so unique that only God's Messiah could have achieved it. And so this man, Jesus, had to be the Christ. There would be no question that you would want to hear more about this because the things Paul say actually makes sense. You've never seen it before. You never thought about it this way before. So you're going to ask him, come back the next Sabbath. And he will for 3 Sabbaths, 3 weeks. He's going to come back, and he's going to preach, and he's going to net some results. Acts 17:4, some of the Jews are persuaded. Luke says they joined Paul and Silas there, which means they threw in their lot with them. Another group identified in verse 4 is along with a great multitude of God-fearing Greeks. So these are the proselytes, Greeks that were converted over to Judaism, believing in one God, and it must have been a large number who Paul convinced. And then finally, there is a number of the leading women there in verse 4. That word number in the New American Standard is literally not a few, or we may say quite a lot of the leading women. And those are going to be the women who are probably married to high officials, who have a lot of sway or influence, who are attending here. So they have come over and joined with Paul. And so the congregation Thessalonica begins with this 4-fold assembly of people who have varying backgrounds. The church is made up of a few Jews, some Gentile proselytes from Judaism, some leading women as well, large number of Gentile converts out of idolatry. And so it's mostly a Gentile congregation.
This must have been a fairly large
Group.
synagogue.
Probably. Well, and in the group that Paul's putting together, it's not just the group that he's pulling out of the synagogue, he's pulling pagans out of the city as well, and they're following him. And so we're going to see, as we know, there's going to be some jealousy there in verse 5 from the rest of the leading Jews. But in 1 Thessalonians, when you read through that this week, and I know you will, notice you won't find one Old Testament quote from the Old Testament. Not one. Because he's talking mainly to Gentiles. And how long did he get to talk and teach this congregation? 3 weeks. About 3 weeks. That's it. Before he gets kicked out. Verse 5 tells us the Jews became jealous, probably feeling that his efforts were undermining their own work. So they get together some verse 5, wicked men from the marketplace, and they formed a mob. Wicked men refers to evil or a base men. The word marketplace incorporates 2 words, idler and lounger. And it means that these men frequented the marketplace, and they just hung around doing nothing. They're not working. They're not buying anything. They're just I don't know what they're doing, but they're worthless fellas. You can go pay them, and they'll go do something for you. And so they send them after Paul. They go to the house where they know Paul's staying, and who do they find? Poor Jason is there, and they pull him out, bring him before the authorities to make bogus accusations saying that these men who have upset the world have come here also. And that indicates they knew about Paul and Silas. They probably knew that they've been run out of Philippi. And then they accuse that they act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. Again, indicates that Paul had been preaching about the spiritual kingdom. And Paul mentions that he did this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. And it may also indicate something about the times. The Jews had recently been expelled from Rome because of a troublemaking Jew named Christus, very similar to Christ, and they got it confused, or maybe they did it on purpose in order to say, these are the Christians are causing this problem, or whatever this fella did, and they blamed the Christians for it and expelled them. And who else was expelled that we know from Rome at that time? Yeah, Priscilla and Aquila, because Paul is going to leave here, go to Corinth, and that's where he's going to run into them because they had just got thrown out of Rome. He'll run into them over there in Corinth here just a little bit. And who's Caesar at this time? Claudius, I think. Claudius? I think Claudius is Caesar. It's around 50 A.D. It's the time, because this was written around 50 A.D., 1 Thessalonians. And so these men who brought Jason before these fellas, they receive a pledge from Jason, and that's just a bond or a security that he would pay to the people there in the city to state that he's not going to create any more trouble. They're not going to stir up the things or do the things that he's being accused of. And then Paul gets sent out. Paul leaves, I think, Timothy and a few others behind as he leaves. And Luke tells us something of the Thessalonians. When Paul leaves there, where does he go next? Berea. We learn something about the Thessalonians when he's there, when Luke says that the Bereans were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica. What is noble-minded? I looked up the Greek word. It can mean well-born. It can mean high-born. So really, noble thought. And so not many noble-minded there in Thessalonica. So the Bereans had a nobler disposition about them. They weren't stirred to envy as easily as you would find there in Thessalonica, but rather stirred to what? Truth, to inquiry, seeking out that truth. Because when Paul would preach, what would they do? Search the scripture to see if it was so. So Thessalonians were not as sophisticated, you could say, as the Bereans were. Now, when we open up the letters of Paul that he writes here, we need to keep in mind the circumstances of this beginning of this congregation. We see something of the prejudicial character of the people who lived there. We're not surprised those who did not respond to the gospel would be persecuted by others. The incident involving Jason, the city officials would also, they would probably keep an eye on them. So now you're in a city, you have this new congregation, but you got these groups of Jews keeping an eye on you, and the city officials keeping an eye on you, especially after what's going on up there in Rome. They just kicked all the Christians out for stirring up trouble, which was a bogus claim. So now they're watching them. So how many people are going to be interested in joining that congregation? I mean, what would happen to North Valley if every Sunday we came, there were FBI vehicles parked out there keeping an eye on us because they think we are troublemakers? Would that make you nervous about coming here? It would make me nervous. I'd still come, but it would make me nervous. Man, what's going on? And then you start to hear that over in D.C., they kicked all the Christians out because they think they're stirring up trouble. So it makes you wonder, when is it going to come after us?
In the current political climate, we might get a whole lot more people.
Maybe. So these issues may help us see why Paul is prompted to write his first letter to this young congregation. It's only been a few months after he left, when he's after he's forced to leave, that he writes this letter to them. He's worried about them. Now, again, I mentioned a moment ago, it's probably around the year 50 AD. This may be his first letter he wrote. Could have been Galatians, but I think it's probably 1 Thessalonians. So we date this around then. I think he wrote it while he was there in Corinth on that second missionary journey. And of course, there are many reasons why Paul writes the letter, but I think mostly in his mind is the inexperience of this newly formed congregation. He's got concerns that whether or not are they going to remain faithful. But one of the reasons why I wanted to hark on that idea of evidence, of presenting evidence to them, and then the noble Bereans, and then he's worried about the Thessalonians because he's wondering, did they grasp this intellectually, what I'm telling them, or is this all kind of just emotion? Because when it's based on emotion and then persecution comes, what typically happens? You go away. It's not a root to hold you there. If you don't make an intellectual decision, come to a reasoning thought that, you know what, he's right, and you intellectually realize that and see that, you're more likely to hold firm to what you know. But if it's all just fluff and it's an emotion that, oh, I love this, I want to be part of this. Oh, wait, everyone's being persecuted and driven out, and they're losing their livelihoods and even their lives. You're going to make a decision, intellectual decision then, well, maybe this isn't worth it. You see how that works? The evidence and thinking with the mind is what Paul's looking for. He's not trying to make some sob story to bring people over. He presented evidence to convince the mind rather than to appeal to their feelings. The passion of the moment can easily burn itself out. But when our mind is convinced of the truth of the evidence, then conviction is a lot more solid. It's got to be one of the most major decisions a person makes in their life if genuine. What would make living with such a decision more difficult is when it's an unpopular decision. And being a Christian in Thessalonica at that time was not popular. So we must be personally convicted before we can convince others of truthfulness, of what we now believe and what we may teach. Do we really understand the evidence that is being presented to us in the Bible? In our age, people seem to be more attracted to their religion than to truth. They're more like the jealous Jews who don't want anyone coming in and saying their religion is wrong or to rob them of the members of their congregation. I think it's doubtful that very many moderns wear the name of Christ would endure persecution because what they possess is not really the truth if they're forced to make a decision about that in their minds. But I want us to go through 1 Thessalonians with this in mind because this is Paul's worry about them. Do they understand the evidence? And so we're going to be working through this on Pew Packers and on Wednesday night, and I hope that we'll glean some good things from this and have some good discussions. Go ahead.
It's not like you left them without anything.
Well, it's true. He left behind Silas and Timothy, who came back later on. He did preach to him for a little while. He preached for 3 weeks and got kicked out.
There was support.
How long does he generally stay in a place? A year. Yeah, or more. 3 weeks is not very long.
Well, I understand that, but again, he left support.
I mean, Ephesus and Galatia, Corinth are all going to prove that even when you were there for years, it doesn't. And I think, you know what, that's kind of funny because in those places where he was there for years, they had more trouble in those cities than Thessalonica did. He was there for only 3 weeks. My understanding is that most synagogues had a copy of the law and prophets.
And that's still the case, but that doesn't
Well,
mean,
Thessalonica would have had those copies too.
yeah, but that doesn't mean everybody can go in and rummage through.
No, nowhere. No, even if you're wealthy, you're not going to be able to do that. I'm sure they probably just went to their priest or whoever was head of the rabbi. You're not priest. Their rabbi and asked, "Hey, what does that say?" And they pull out the scrolls and take a look. So read through 1 Thessalonians. It's not long, pretty short, 5 chapters, but there is a lot there. We're gonna do 1st and 2nd Thessalonians for pew packers. We'll spend a few months there and again, hopefully glean a few things